Property Committee to order. First item on the agenda is pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. Public comments. Nobody has approached either of us relative to their desire to speak. Therefore, we will move on to the approval of the minutes of the August 23rd meeting. I gave the clerk suggested changes relative to the motion to allow for staff to pursue options relative to self-funding. The motion was made, but it didn't clarify what the motion was. We're just trying to seek to clarify we're adopting the staff recommendation.
I haven't changed it.
And she has
On the
done it.
website.
So with that, what are your wishes relative to the minutes?
Move to approve as corrected.
Is there a second?
Second.
Moved by Gibbs, seconded by Jean. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of approving the minutes as modified will signify by saying aye.
What are the implications again? What's the modification?
So if you look at item operational functions, you made the motion. It says motion by Marshall, but it doesn't say what the motion was. And so the motion by Marshall to allow staff to pursue self-funding options.
Okay.
So it's just clarifying what the motion was, because we had the recommendation, but they had you making the motion, but not what the motion was. So now we're making sure that the minutes reflect what you did.
Okay.
Any other questions? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. All right. Without objection, I'm going to defer the going into the closed session until the end of the agenda, unless there's an objection. I think it just flows better and we don't have to kick people out and bring them back in. All right. The next item is funding considerations for Marathon County broadband commitments. And I'll try to cue that issue up. We had earmarked a portion of the ARPA dollars for broadband expansion efforts, and we had basically earmarked $3,950,835 for broadband funds for broadband expansion. That was based upon proposals that we had from Frontier, Bug Tussle, and Serenity, this round of the Public Service Commission grants. We've never taken that formally to the county board for approval of allocating the ARPA dollars. We did take the agreements to commit those, but we don't have a separate motion, and that's been a concern of Christy Palmer's going forward. And our funding was based upon a request of $944,835 from Frontier, based upon approximately 4,000 people served. They later modified the scope of their project to 10,000, but agreed to stick with the initial 944,000 because that was what went through the broadband task force in the infrastructure committee. For the others, we had agreed to $235 per business or resident served. Bug Tussle made a request of us of financial support in the tune of $3 million. That was, a portion of it was to be a loan, similar to the loan agreement that we had entered into with them back in November and December of last year as part of the conduit bonding. The intent was to look at ARPA as the source of that loan. We have subsequently found that ARPA is not, we can't do a 30-year loan with ARPA or through ARPA. Any loan we make has to be repaid within the time frame of ARPA. So they would be entitled to approximately $152,985 based upon the number of businesses and residents served in their project area. And then we had agreed to provide $70,000 to Serenity or Wittenberg Tell. They unfortunately did not receive funding through the PSC, so that proposal's off the table. So we have a request for $1,097,820. We had $114,000 plus change from the previous capital improvement program that we carried over for these grant requests, so we would apply that first. But in a meeting that we had with Bug Tussle last Friday, we explored, and we was Chris Holman, Mike Brenner, Chair Gibbs, and myself had a discussion with them about how do we go about structuring our loan with Bug Tussle for serving, it's the leather camp area down in Croninwater. And we again had committed to that loan. Our intent is to look at fund balance and to use terms similar to what we had with the conduit borrowing with them, and we're working on a term sheet. We'll eventually bring that agreement back to the committee. But we need to advance to the county board the formal request for committing the ARPA dollars and have a formal resolution in the tune of at least $1,097,820, reflecting our commitment to both Frontier and Bug Tussle. And that will be serving approximately 11,000 people through the expansion of broadband. Kurt, Mike, Chris, or Lance, do you want to add anything?
Well, I think, Mr. Chairman, if I might, it was 11,000 households, not
Right.
and businesses, not necessarily
Right.
11,000 people. So it'd be potentially a significant bigger number as far as a percentage of the population. But I think, I think you hit it on the head. I think that the term sheet that we're trying to work up is similar to the funding availability that we allowed them to utilize on the other major project, 300 and some miles of fiber, along with the additional towers that they're putting up. Like I said, I think that works to the county's advantage because it's not an outright grant, other than the 152,000 roughly, which is a similar amount per household that is served. So I think in the long run, and the county actually makes a few dollars, a few points, almost 40 basis points on the loan. So I think it works that we actually are making progress on providing broadband to the community that consistently has been underserved, and now we understand the complexities and the need for broadband, especially coming out of the pandemic.
So I guess what we're looking for today is are you comfortable with exploring the use of fund balance? And the fund balance is money that we have set aside for cash flow and other purposes, and we have exceeded we are currently above our minimum. What we would do is we would allocate it, but we would be paid back. We have that secured by the assets, so there's if they default, we take over their fiber and would have an asset that we would in turn be able to sell, similar to what we had done with them in the agreement last fall and winter, it would net us actually a higher rate of return than what we're currently getting through putting the money in the bank, a much higher rate of return. So I think we're looking for, are you comfortable with our approach that would free up either for broadband or other purposes some of the ARPA dollars? But currently we earmarked, again, that $3,950,835 for broadband expansion. There will be opportunities in the future for us to partner with other parties relative to broadband expansion. And quite honestly, the areas in the future will be the hardest to serve because those are the areas where the rate of return is not as high. And it may require more government investment. It will be communities like the town of Harrison and the more sparsely populated communities, but we'll need to deal with those and work with the internet service providers in the future. So there may be a additional request for some or all of the dollars that were allocated for broadband. And again, this is based on, we're bringing it to you today based upon a discussion that we had late last week with, I guess on Thursday with Bug Tussle. Any questions? Any concerns? So I think the next step would be for us to then work on a resolution dealing with the allocation of the ARPA funds, and then once we have the term sheet completed with Bug Tussle, to bring that back to this body and ultimately the county board for action. Chair Gibbs.
I think what we're looking at is effectively 2.8, a little better than 2.8 million of, well, $2,847,015 would be a loan from reserve. 152,985 would be a grant outright to Bug Tussle. The remaining of the 197,820 would be a grant to Frontier from ARPA, minus the 114 plus change carryover from the CIP. Is that correct?
Yes, we're looking, I asked Christy for updated numbers and she gave me some, but I'm afraid that it might not be all of Serenity's. We've had 2 grants to Serenity, so I think we need to get that, but there's approximately 114,000 left in that fund.
Let's just develop the resolution, bring it back for discussion, based on the general principle.
Christy, do you want to chime in?
If there's a second payment to Serenity this year, I think it was just that the first one's been made. Second one wasn't encumbered, so your total balance should be 114,733.
Okay. Thank you. All right. We will proceed, and you'll see that issue again, but we wanted to share that discussion with you. Again, we would make, pledge to Bug Tussle $3 million, of which 2.8 would be a loan payable along the lines of the others, and the other becomes a grant at the completion of their work. So if they don't complete it, it's a loan. If they do complete it, we forgive 652 times 235. All right. We will move on to the operational functions, approval of the September claims. Those were emailed to you. Any questions? Comments or motions?
Motion to approve.
Moved by Supervisor Zhang, seconded by Supervisor Lemmer. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of approval of the claims and question costs will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. 2022 intergovernmental budget transfers. Christy, I think you have in your packet the medical examiner's request.
Yep, this is just a continuation of the grant she's got. Here, I'll go on camera. And she just has an additional amount funded, and that description shows what that grant is for. It's very helpful for her, and that's why it's up for budget transfer.
Any questions? Again, it's a grant to offset some of our costs. Any questions? If not, a motion is in order. Moved by Supervisor Leahy. Vice Chair, is there a second? Second by Supervisor Hart. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. Update on tax deed property, Village of Edgar, tax deed parcel 2014-7. Michael.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Committee probably recalls this is the roadway that the county currently owes after taking it by tax deed. It's located in the Village of Edgar. I did have a chance to talk with the Village of Edgar administrator. Your direction to me was to first discern whether the village was interested in gaining ownership over this parcel, and if so, talk to them about potentially a sale from the county to the village that would be for the amounts that the county paid the village to settle on the taxes that were unpaid on this parcel. The village is willing to enter into that type of an agreement, and I would attribute it to my keen negotiating, but really the village was very, very willing to do that. So I guess what I'm looking for is whether the committee wants me to engage in that and finalize that sale with the Village of Edgar.
I'm seeing nodding heads. Chair Gibbs.
I'll make a motion to direct Corp Counsel to negotiate the facilitation of the transfer of the property that's in tax deed, the village's road right-of-way, road and right-of-way,
Second.
since we're not going to be putting up a toll booth.
So is that a resolution that will need to go to the county board eventually? Or is that committee?
I believe that's committee specific because it is still tax deed property, and the county board has delegated the tax deed property process to this committee.
All right, so the resolution will then come, once you reach that agreement and set the terms, it'll come back here for our action and then be done.
Yes.
Thank you. Any questions? Did you get the second? Okay. If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. All right. Process of sale of surplus property, 611 Chalice Street, Wausau. Mike?
All right. More property. This is not a tax deed parcel. This is a parcel that the county now owns. It was previously subject to a City of Wausau right-of-way. The city vacated its right-of-way, which meant that the property reverted to its previous owner, which happened to be Marathon County. So we have this property that we now own. In your packet, there's a map that indicates where this property lies. It's basically right on the edge of 17th Avenue, near the border of the city of Wausau and the town of Rib Mountain. As I indicated, it was previously a right-of-way property, so there's nothing on this parcel. The parcel is 0.18 acres. Initially, our clerk received some interest from the adjacent landowner about purchasing this property. Subsequently, that landowner did enter an offer to purchase the property. This landowner is also the owner of the property to the north, which was purchased through our tax deed process for $1,000. It's a similarly sized plot, but it's a little bit smaller than this existing plot that is currently before you. Their offer to purchase is also for $1,000. Because this isn't a tax deed property, what state statute says is that the county board can engage in the sale of county-owned land under terms that the county board approves. So there aren't the specific limitations that we go through with our tax deed process, but certainly coming up with a fair sale price is an appropriate thing for the committee to consider. We don't have an appraisal or an appraised value on this parcel for a few reasons. One, it was just returned to our ownership, and two, we haven't been trying to sell it yet. We just have the amounts that the nearby properties were sold for, or specifically the property directly to the north, which was sold for $1,000. So we have that offer to purchase. I guess what I was looking for, Mr. Chair, was some direction from the committee on whether we wanted to pursue this offer or look at an appraisal, or how the committee wanted to proceed.
Gail?
If the property is adjacent to, or the person who put the offer in, is their intent to combine the properties and build on them? Because on a .8, you probably can't build, but adjacently, that would make it far more valuable.
I would imagine that's probably the intent, although they didn't specifically express that, but I think that's probably a fair assumption.
And
The
I
clerk-
do think
the
that
clerk-
we,
If I could, Gail, the clerk has a comment on that.
When he called to inquire about it, he did state that was his intention, was to combine and develop the property.
with that comment, I think that $1,000 is not an appropriate amount. We would be underselling that the land is worth a lot more than that. So I would be opposed to $1,000.
And we talked about this last week, and we wanted to get a flavor of the committee. The problem is that it has value only probably to the adjacent owner, and it sort of becomes that remnant parcel. And if it were a tax deed, we would typically go out and appraise the property and have that as a baseline. But we had that offer, and before we could establish and talk about how we would go about disposing it. So we're reacting to the offer to purchase, not necessarily, so we have a process with tax delinquent property where we go out, we do an environmental scan before we take title to it, but then prior to the sale, we typically will appraise the property. And the question is whether you wish to follow that process. I guess in essence, we're rejecting the offer to purchase pending an appraisal of that property. And the appraisals typically cost about $400. Supervisor Marshall.
I would not be opposed to spending the $400 to get an appropriate appraisal on the property. Also, you had said that we had not tried to sell it. We should be letting people know that it's available so that we have multiple purchasers, and that would be the appropriate way that you do market values.
We're having a little discussion about, we have a process by which we advertise our tax deed property. We haven't otherwise put, that's part of our committee work plan to develop this policy of how do we deal with surplus property. Is there anything that would prohibit us from putting it on that, along with the tax deed property for advertisement for? We can,
I could check to see if we could do a separate web page, because the page that we have is primarily and only for tax deed property, and there's a lot of statutory language and processes on there. And I think it would be confusing to people if we put up a parcel that is not subject to those statutory requirements and processes. It would have to be, and we don't have anything in place right now to sell property that is not tax deed property. So it would be a process probably to figure that out.
Chris, and then Cody.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm not completely sure of the timing on this in terms of when it needs to be resolved, but one potential avenue the committee could explore is bringing in Wisconsin Surplus. They're an online site. They do auctions. They do it for tax deed properties as well as surplus properties for counties all throughout the state. And in previous experience, I can say that the committee can kind of determine sort of the value they want to see the property listed for, but there's also strategies involved with sort of setting a rate that encourages sort of the bidding process that can really let the market set the value based on what gets put out there. And I do know that the gentleman who runs that is willing and able to come up to counties and explain to them how it works, what they do for them, any of the costs involved, things like that. So if that was something of interest and within the time frame, we could arrange for that person to come up and give you guys some insight.
Cody?
Yeah, and I just wanted to speak in favor of applying the tax deed property process to this where, if that's possible.
I think we can take portions of that process. We wouldn't do the notification because it's not subject to the same statutory requirements. So we could, we can look at the appraisal. We can determine, I think, that an operational decision of whether we post it on a separate process, use the Wisconsin surplus property for posting, but get the appraisal, advertise it, and then bring it back, is what I'm hearing. Is that the consensus of the committee? Do we want to, I think it'd be, in light of the fact that we have a formal offer to purchase before us, we should take action. So Supervisor Marshall, did you want to make a motion?
Yes, I'll make a motion to deny the purchase agreement before us.
And follow
And follow the procedures of tax deeded property as available to us.
is appropriate? All right. Sorry for modifying your amendment. Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Hart. Any discussion? Go ahead.
And it's entirely possible that we go through that entire process and come back to the same offer but at least we go through the process and see if there's any other offers, correct?
That's correct. You could get a lower offer. But that's the risk you take and for due diligence. Please.
Okay, so this is what I have. Motion by Marshall, second by Hart, to deny the offer to purchase and follow the tax deed process where appropriate to dispose of the property. Okay.
Any questions? If not, all those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye. Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. All right. Now for the resolution to approve the 2023 capital improvement plan projects. Chris, you're taking the lead?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chair. Thank you. First of all, I'd just like to thank all the staff, facilities, and others who've kind of helped bring me up to speed in terms of where the county's been in this. For some of the people who might not know, my understanding of things is that when the county eliminated the CIP committee, that then came to this committee in terms of how to navigate the CIP program and process. The policy we had at the time was also suspended to free up space that we needed to move the program towards the request from the committee and board for a more staff-driven process, with the committee ultimately reviewing and approving that, obviously. But that CIP program having an emphasis on the capital budget for the following year's budget with the 5-year program as well. So the 5-year plan is part of that, and that will also be affected by what happens with the capital budget itself once that's fully formed. So as a planning tool, it can live and breathe alongside your decisions, and we can bring an updated version of that plan for informational purposes, at some point before the next budget cycle starting, so we kind of have a level set, if you will, in terms of what CIP looks like for following years. What you received in your packet is a preliminary project list that captures what we receive from departments for consideration. So it's organized by project type, mandatory or compliance, end of life, recurring. There's some rolling stock, which you could view as recurring as well, and new. There's also information only and some decline projects that are listed so that you can see the whole picture. And the 5-year framework accompanied that list as well. In addition, the budget form that finance uses to allocate funding as part of the budget process was included, and that will ultimately be populated with the project plan that you approve. The projects and funding will come back to you for approval along with all the other budget pieces in October. So in the past, the committee would do some ranking. We wanted to move away from that. Now we're looking at just a list of projects and then working with the funding process to figure out, based on the list and sort of the determination and recommendations, how that funding plays through the list that you ultimately approve. What I understand was requested was that staff take the lead on developing that plan and bring in a more fully formed version of that plan with recommendations for your approval. So I've worked with facilities quite a bit over the last couple of months to move that process to where we are today. They're here in the back to help answer questions that you might have. And primarily our work focused on placing all the projects we received in their categories. So that's what you saw color-coded on the one spreadsheet with different tabs. That color coding did not play into the budget sheet, but you had both versions of the project lists. And that priority order would also, and from our point of view at this point, be the same for funding, in the sense that in order to avoid situations where there's some sort of compliance issue or something that really should be taken care of if it's end of life, that those are really sort of top tiers in terms of where the funding goes, so that there's not some sort of experience like we've had in the past where something just didn't quite make a cut and then further deteriorated and caused some fiscal issues down the road. Within each area, we can work on providing a recommendation as well, though I do think that the mandatory and end of life are probably things that are just must-dos, generally speaking. There can be some play within end of life, and we can kind of interrogate that as those project requests come forward, if need be, and based upon funding availability. But probably the most play, if you will, in terms of recommendation and sort of where we'd like to see funding go will be in the new category. So some department heads are here. There might be some online as well that can also speak to some of the projects. If you have questions about that, Administrator Leonard can also speak to any questions you have for him, as we've been discussing the plan with him for the last week or so, and his feedback will also be incorporated into this. So today, we're looking for sort of additional feedback you could provide us with that will help shape what we bring back to you in the way of a recommendation at your next meeting, potentially before or after the CWA meeting. We'll talk with Chair Robinson about that. And just to kind of carry you through the process, like after that 2023 capital budget is approved, the conversation that we want to have will continue to develop the CIP program. And as you know, Workday is part of where we're at in terms of transitioning the county. So anything that can positively impact the process there, we can incorporate as well, so that, this is sort of a bridge year between old and new and different platforms between Kayenta and Workday. So really we're hoping to kind of use the conversation we have over the next month or two with you to shape something that puts us in a good position for sort of that long-term plan and strategy, et cetera, policy, if you will, for 2024 and beyond. And just a note, I did include the resolution in your packet for today just in case we needed it. Based on the conversation and where we go, I don't know that we'll need any action on that today. But if you have any questions, we're all here to answer them as best we can.
Chris, I have a couple. Why is a groundwater study a capital expense?
It's a good question. It's one that's come up many times in terms of, does it fit within CIP? Because like cost-wise, you can think of a plan as being longer term in terms of use, but it's really not a piece of infrastructure. I think that the dollar figure and sort of the way the county would utilize it over time lent itself to inclusion here, but I do think it begs the question about funding. Like, it may be more appropriate to fund it outside of a typical CIP process, could be ARPA, something like that, so that if the committee wished to move that forward, that we could still do that and find a different way to account for the funding.
So could you, for the sake of the new members, just go through the projects not funded by KIP, and we have bituminous surfacing in there with no dollar amount, and you've got a number below. Could you just go through, if you could, the different the projects not funded, which is the rolling stock and the continuous projects, recurring projects, and then the technology projects, and why we separate those out?
Sure. So it's a good point you raised, because I do think that part of the policy or the planning as we move forward might actually treat all of those things differently. Like one thing we could do would be to incorporate them within the budget as line items, and we could still fund them the same way, but you could see the capital improvement, if you will, differently, so that there's a real differentiation between sort of the recurring funding things like the highway projects, or you have rolling stock, sometimes that's called like a vehicle replacement fund, things like that. You could look at them differently so they don't get confused with something that's more of a traditional capital project. This budget sheet right now is looking at things that have been recurring projects that are funded through the end of year process. After the audit, there's an amount of money that gets dispersed, I guess, through the things that aren't funded through other mechanisms. And there's several ways that any of these capital projects could be funded, but the recurring tend to get allocations, or if there's some specific project in bridges and culverts, that would fluctuate based on what would be on the docket for highway. So they're not funded by CIP, but as I understand it, they've been included historically because they're sort of CIP adjacent in terms of, a lot of people don't think of roads and culverts as depreciable assets, but if you pay attention to the highway or infrastructure meetings, they really are. It's probably the most valuable thing the county owns and the most expensive thing to maintain. And so in that sense, you might see it as being peripheral, but it really is related in a capital sense, but handled differently. Similarly, I think there are some questions when it comes to some of the CCIT things or phones, stuff like that, where it might have been handled traditionally as more of a recurring thing, or recurring in the sense that we know it has to happen every so often in bigger chunks because you're replacing equipment. But there might be different strategies we explore there too, wherein you would set aside a certain amount of money each year out of that same funding process so that you're getting smaller bites, so that at the end of the life you have that money that you've kind of allocated over time versus needing any sort of big chunks all at once.
So as it relates to the IT projects, I know in the past we would purchase systems or software and platforms, and you'd have a one-time upfront cost, and then there may be an annual contract. But they've moved away from that into license agreements where it basically shifts it to operational. And we struggled with that, and Supervisor Leahy led that work group, but we struggled with how do we pay for, if you've got a 5-year license, you used to capitalize that agreement, and how are we dealing with that going forward?
CCIT might have spoken more specifically on that one. I do know that generally speaking, when you're talking about assets that exist in the cloud, it kind of gets to the point that you're talking about. It might not be tangible in the traditional sense, and some people might argue that it's operational, but it's really sort of an operational capital cost. It blurs the line in some strict definitions, and I don't know if Administrator Leonard has any particular insight in terms of how CCIT is approaching it, but I think generally speaking, you've seen that shift not only with software, but with, storage is becoming something as well, where you need to figure out how to strategize around that, because the amount of data that we're taking in through law enforcement or other agencies and departments is logarithmically increasing per year. And the costs for that are changing too, because what might have been traditionally handled through sort of a normal help desk or support desk for a particular program is now not being, that you get penalized for some of the old school approaches to IT as they encourage you to kind of move in the direction that everybody's moving in, but then the costs for that don't necessarily go down. So it might seem like it would, because now you don't have as much of a tangible asset, but the costs for that are significant.
If I may, Mr. Chair, just not sure I'm going to add clarity here, but what I think you see when you look at this document, the one that's up on your screen, and then you look at the conversation we've had to this point, is that the document before you is a document that we've used for many years, and it was meant not only to do the things that Chris talked about, and I think it does it well, and it breaks out, what these projects are, and it's built in some respect around funding streams, which Chris has talked about. But also I think one real tangible piece that this sheet provides is transparency. So to the chair's question about why are some of these projects on this document that might not otherwise meet the definition of a capital project, and the groundwater plan is one. It's also not, a groundwater plan, that large dollar amount isn't something you traditionally put in a departmental budget, because when you look at your budget book, the last couple pages, we have the 5-year history of what funding has been within departments. And if we loaded those sort of projects into departmental budgets, the budgets are going to yo-yo, right? You're going to see a budget increase by 20% in terms of levy, when really the budget's not increasing 20%. A specifically large project was moved forward during that year. So this sheet that's on your screen really kind of seeks to straddle those two worlds. It tries to be very transparent for the board and the public about the projects that are being moved forward in any one calendar year as a part of the budget. And at the same time, it also seeks to really lay out the capital expenditures for the county and the corresponding funding stream that will be identified later. So the projects at the top, projects not funded by capital improvement, CIP, those are things that have other funding sources. The greatest example that you see every year is there are projects down at the solid waste department that the solid waste department funds, because they are an enterprise fund. They develop their own funding for those projects. Just like Chris said, you set up a fund, a reserve within an enterprise account to fund those capital projects on an ongoing basis. And then as you move down, you start to see us transition to Supervisor Robinson's point. Technology projects, they're moving from those things that you could see and touch, right? You know, when you would walk into Best Buy and you'd buy a Microsoft Office CD that you would load in your computer and it would be licensed. That no longer exists. We're moving to this software as a service where it's an annual subscription. And it, again, that causes tension between, well, what is it? Is it capital? Is it not? Is it operations, or is it something you can borrow for? And the answer that, you know, we need to develop that answer. I do believe some counties are borrowing for those software as a service expenses, but I haven't delved into that and developed an answer. Right now, we're focusing on the work that Supervisor Leahy led through the work group, which was really breaking out our capital expenditures into those things that, quite honestly, we need to do. We don't want to be ranking a roof. The question for the board is whether or not we're staying in that building for the foreseeable future, and then is it a required end of life or maintenance expense? And if we're staying if the answers to both are yes, we need to find a funding strategy to do it. So you see kind of the evolution of that document over time. That's what I see when I look at those documents. And one of the questions that over the next couple of weeks before your next meeting at the Central Wisconsin Airport, when you have your joint airport board meeting, and I think the hope is that we can have a specific Marathon County HR Finance and Property meeting that day as well, as Chris alluded to. The work that we're going to be doing as staff is, again, delving into that list of what is required maintenance, and are there things, for example, that we can move further into that 5-year capital plan that don't need to be done in 2023. Because as we'll talk about in a little bit with your budget assumptions, you do have a fair amount of debt coming on to the county levy, and we want to make sure we structure our projects, we time our projects is probably a better way to say that, in such a way as to not cause the tax rate to do the same thing that I talked about with departmental budgets. We don't want it to go up and down. Stable tax rates serve the community well. So how do we make sure we don't bring more debt on in a sense, in a schedule or a time schedule that causes that tax rate to move? So that's going to be the conversation that we're having. I'll tell you some of the projects that, in my estimation, we have an opportunity to move those out in terms of timing and really have a meaningful discussion about what does the future look like. are the last three on the list that is up on the screen. And those, I know it's difficult to read, but those are the projects, three projects down at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point Wausau campus. Now, there's a considerable project, $425,000 for some renovation work at the university. We need to have a conversation about, okay, what does the master plan for that facility look like? What's the relationship look like between the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point campus and the county for maintenance services? Similarly with the roof replacement, trying to figure those things out. Those haven't risen to the level of we need to fix it tomorrow or we need to fix it next year. Based on my initial review and conversation with Chris and initial conversation with Terry, I think we can slide those things further into the 5-year capital plan to allow that planning to happen. So those are the things that we're going to do over the next month. And the feedback that we're asking for from this committee, either today or in that intervening time, or certainly at that future meeting before the county board, is that same sort of feedback. Hey, you know, what we want, we believe there's a policy question that we as an elected body want to have a discussion about a particular project and need. But staff, in furtherance of the direction from that work group that was led by Supervisor Leahy, as Chris alluded to, this is going to be a much more staff-heavy process up until that meeting. Ultimately, it's still absolutely a question for this committee and ultimately through the budget from the board. But we're going to do a lot of that. What used to be the ranking, we're going to try to do that on the staff side to provide you as much information as possible.
So what you have is basically the request less two. I think you kicked out two.
Yes.
And so
yes.
you're going to further refine that as we go through the process. For instance, Dancy Tower, we've already dealt with, so that can come out and.
Correct. I think some of those projects that we've handled, like whether it's some of the highway projects that are tied to some of the ARPA funding decisions that have been made recently, or the Dancy Tower, we'd still want to kind of account for them within the plan so that they can kind of nest within that longer term look, and we would be able to see it coming with that fine-tuned 5-year plan. But to your point, the funding piece of it would go away, or would account for the decisions the board's already made.
Supervisor Leahy, do you want to make any comments in light of the work that you did last time? Put you on the spot.
Pretty much only to say that most of the work was done by staff. So, no, it was a good conversation. I think most of the points have already been raised. In simplistic terms, it was just trying to make the process more efficient and modernized, and making sure that we didn't let things fall through the cracks. Yeah, that was basically it.
So questions. I think there's probably need for clarification on some of these items. I would assume that we get them, but the courthouse north end envelope replacement, it's a pretty expensive envelope. But, I think we just would need additional clarification as to what the project scopes would be. Supervisor Lemmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just trying to go through my notes and my memory, the Public Safety Training Response Center on Packer Drive. Last time that was talked about that I remember, it was in June, and it was brought as like a preliminary, just get this on your radar, and now it looks like it's really on our radar. So the discussion was we can put about a $1.3 million in fixing a roof and some siding and insulation, some other stuff, or build this $3.2 million building. So can you just talk about how that evolved?
Well, I can just say that it will further evolve and kind of move into a future year. It's one of those projects, too, that we've identified as something that there may be some interest in moving forward. So you want to nest it within the plan, but that and a couple others will move forward so we can say, we still know that these exist. We need to figure out how to treat them. And if we're going to move forward, then you would further break them down to your point to say, we're not just going to, like in 2025, there's like $75 million for a highway facility. Clearly, if that was something that we did move in that direction, you break that down into several constituent parts over different years within the plan So you would see each one of them coming, but you would commit to those steps as you move forward. But same with this. If that became something that was actionable in the truest sense, you would break that out and fund the design piece and then put it into the year that you'd like to see it. So that one will move out of 23, just full disclosure for today.
Other questions? So I think what you're indicating, this is the initial list, you'll refine it, revise it, look at funding source, where it will come from, bring that back to us, and then ultimately it'll go to the county board.
Yeah, no, it was important we thought for you to see everything we got, because clearly we can't fund them all, right? And so that's part of the thinking and long-term planning too. Like, you don't want to have too many things falling into deferred maintenance if you can help it, but also the need is significant. So as we the focus this year really is this bridge year I referenced, is getting that capital budget in place, which we can do. I'm not worried about that at all. But I think that my point about continuing the conversation is to fine tune it to the point that you can start to figure out what's the best strategy we can do, not only to balance out borrowing so you can see when big amounts will be coming down the road, you can reshuffle that deck as well to kind of account for where the county board wants to take debt service, rather than having like big project, just in a list arbitrarily. You would move it around based on at least a loose strategy that then gets further refined each year as you move forward. So, and again, getting your feedback or any ideas, and also having some new members, wanting to be sure that people were all brought up to speed and why we're doing it this way was important. So even if there were things within particular categories that the committee felt were relevant in terms of what staff should be considering in that prioritization process that we bring to you, then we can incorporate that, and you'd see that reflected in the end product.
Any questions, comments? I see that blank stare, they see that says, please provide more clarification, which we will get as we move through this process. So it will come, we will bring this to you multiple times, but I think the critical thing today is that this is the initial list by which we will whittle down, prioritize, move to different years, and it's ultimately what will we accept and recommend to the county board, and what will the county board approve. So there are multiple steps going forward, but this is the universe of the projects that are currently before us, because invariably something always comes in at the last minute.
If I may, Mr. Chair, the one other thing I'll add, and I know this committee recognizes it from the list, but all of the ARPA projects that you also move forward for consideration to go through the budget process, those are in there. To Supervisor Lemmer's point about the renovation to the training center on Packer Drive, that's in there because this committee asked it to be considered through the budget. So as Deputy Administrator Holman indicated, I don't think you need to, I think we all recognize that $22 million, that number at the bottom for kind of those projects, I can guarantee you that number will not be the ones that are funded, because as Chris said, we need to there's a lot of things that enter into it. What truly is a need in terms of end-of-life maintenance in that facility on Packer Drive? Are there things that can push that out further into that 5-year capital plan in light of all the other considerations we have? So to Chair Robinson's point about the stairs of, I don't know if I'd call them blank stares, but stares of concern. Fully expected that, fully recognize that. Staff will bring you back a list that you'll see more things move out in that 5-year direction.
All right. We will see that again, and we'll talk later about when we see that, whether it's next week or the week after. All right. Let's then move on to the employee health insurance plan update.
I'll take this one as well. I get all the fun today. No, so just as you'll recall, the last time we were here discussing the health insurance, we were looking at a potential 8.5% increase from GHT. we had been looking at the self-funded option and like what might that look like if we pursued it, and ultimately sought your permission to kind of pursue that path in concurrent to the other. You know, we're bringing all options to the table. So the first thing I guess I should say is that during that meeting too, we heard that GHT would be coming back to us with sort of their best and final offer, if you will. And so it's important to kind of, if you can, take that 8.5% out of your brain and the chart that you saw out of your brain. And the update should hopefully provide some, some context for you in terms of where we are now. So last week on Friday, Molly, myself, and Eric, we had a meeting where we discussed kind of the overall situation in terms of what we got back from GHT. And the offer that they proposed back to us was a 2% renewal, so which is a big improvement on the 8.5% and a little more in alignment in terms of what you might expect when you went to market looking for health insurance options. There is a small tweak to it. The 2% premium renewal includes a carve out of the wellness program in the clinic, which is something we were already kind of looking at, because if we pursued a self-funded approach, you would account for that separately as well. So that wasn't too much of a surprise, but the real positive part with the 2%, in my opinion, or our opinion, I should say, is that we had made a bunch of specific requests about the pharmacy plan, and they honored all those requests and essentially ate the costs of that. And so we got a real positive development for sort of how out-of-pocket expenses are handled for the pharmacy side, and Eric can speak to that a little bit as well. But generally speaking, that meeting and GHT's response aligned pretty well with what we were hoping to see if we didn't go self-funded. And there's also sort of a unique wrinkle this year in that, you know, we knew that this conversation was happening between just around health insurance in general. And with the workday component, we had built around, you know, our assumptions as best we knew them. So one additional sort of positive piece to this is that, you know, our recommendation being at this point would be to stay with GHT with the 2% renewal increase, because that would also mean that you're not having to rebuild any of the structural pieces to the workday project on top of all the other changes. And then, let's see. Yeah, so then that's kind of the short and sweet version of in terms of the update in terms of where we came. I think that there's still interest in pursuing self-funded approaches moving forward, but at this point the recommendation from staff is to stay with GHG for 2023. We've got some preliminary ideas about how to handle the overall increase on the county side and employee side, and we'll be communicating that with department heads and staff, you know, today and tomorrow. So that's all ongoing. It's been pretty quick in terms of when we got the information in, you know, the last couple of days. And
So I know that there are members of the committee that are interested in a long-term evaluation of options relative to how we go about providing services and potential management and bundling of services. So understanding that we've got time constraints this year, how would you anticipate that we could address those or set those up for future discussions? And how would we do that? It's difficult between now and January 1st, but are there opportunities for us to put together a work group to look at it similar to what we had in the past, or is because we seem to with GHT, I'm going to be honest, is we seem to get an increase and then we say, well, we're going to go out competitively, and then they revise the rates, and at what point in time do they stop revising? And if we haven't kept our options open, how do we control those costs, $13 million out of the budget?
yeah, it's a good question. I think generally speaking, in my experience, regardless of your approach, it's probably good practice to seek what your options are every year. Especially, I mean, even if you go self-funded, there's elements of that you'd want to be re-looking every year to see how things are changing, because it's such a volatile sort of part of the world. There's change happening all of the time. So a lot of self-funded counties will do that. They go out each year to bid, and you can get the same sort of play with the the responses, I guess. I think that, to me, an interesting part about, if staying with GHT and them having carved out the wellness program and the clinic of their offer to us puts us in a position of kind of extending the work we've already done now, but by moving forward, we're going to be handling those separately, which we would have done under the self-funded approach. And so if there was still interest in exploring the self-funded approach next year, you would have sort of figured out how to handle those two pieces in advance of that. And really, you'd be just looking at, okay, what's the core premium plan approach or, option that we have now that we've managed to handle these things outside of that. So if there was interest in a work group, we could certainly put something together, but I do think that it could be as simple, if the committee was interested in that, in next year, just being very deliberate about going out again to the market to see, here's where we are, here's what we're interested in. We've already carved these pieces out ourselves based on a 2023 plan, and then we can see what comes back in the way of responses for 2024.
Gail, I'm going to put you on the spot if I can, because I know you've had a significant interest in this area. Do you have concerns or questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just curious as to, do we know what the broker fees are? I know that by law, if you ask, they have to tell you.
So from how I'm compensated on a fee basis only. So it's $58,000 per year is what my firm makes. There's no commissions or hidden costs attributable. It's all just fees that the county pays on a monthly basis.
Thank you.
Yep.
And my other question is the carve out, the wellness program, the clinic, what is the cost the county is taking that? And so really the 2% isn't a 2%, because what is the effective percent of the rate?
I'll touch on it and let Eric fill in the gaps, but essentially the 2% is the premium increase, and then a 1.9% in addition would be associated with those carve-outs. So really it's an overall 3.9% that will kind of, depending on how we handle it, we'll work through budgets, in different ways. We really got to figure out what that final decision is in terms of the numbers. We're also doing work, and I know Eric's been talking with folks about interrogating the numbers that we know we've seen from GHT and via Aspirus to figure out getting a true read on what does that really look like, so that we can account for it now and then also moving forward, because I wouldn't call it discrepancies, but maybe just sort of needing to get some answers, to figure out, well, maybe you can speak to this better, Eric, but really trying to get a truer read on what that looks like. But basically, the 1.9% portion of the 3.9 is tied to that wellness and clinic piece, whereas the 2% is dedicated strictly to the premium side.
Yeah, so Group Health Trust was paying Aspirus for the clinic as well as the wellness piece of that. So we had limited visibility in what that was and the itemization of that. So by pulling that out of the actual health insurance through Group Health Trust, we're going to be able to, interrogate Aspirus, if you will, to get more of an itemization of what all those components are, because right now GHT really they're just paying Aspirus on a monthly basis. And when the county has to do that, we want to have a comfort level on what Aspirus is receiving.
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure that it was apples to apples. So really, instead of the 8.5% that they had, now it's down to 3.9. So there is a win there. I do think there needs to be a work group, because there's a lot of innovation in self-funding, as well as just the simple going to self-funding. You have a lot more flexibility to innovate, and we've seen that in companies locally. So I would be in favor of a work group. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Other questions or comments? And again, this is an educational presentation today, so an update. Anything else? If not, thank you for that. All right, budget assumptions for 2023. Christy. or Lance. So,
I don't know if Christie's on, but this will be real short if it's me. You know, I think the narrative you've heard from us in the past is, I'm going to echo it again today, the budget process is much like the capital project, the capital process, a living and breathing one. We've been having departmental budget meetings all day today, all day yesterday, and we have them for the foreseeable future. Things do change frequently, as Chris just referenced with health insurance. That's just one component, as is capital. But I do want to just revisit one thing that was alluded to in your previous meetings, but just to clarify. So I pulled up the packet from one of your previous meetings, and it's on the screen now, and it's a chart that talks about our 5-year financial projections. And we've talked a lot about debt service historically. We're going to continue to talk about debt service as I have today. And we've also talked about North Central Healthcare and the financial challenges that they've had, both as a result of the pandemic, but also some things that we're starting to, that are related to construction and things that we really need to address. And as I think everyone on this committee knows, while the project, a lot of the renovation project that we've been talking about is on the North Central Healthcare campus, that debt is Marathon County's debt. And, you know, there certainly are opportunities, and we're working with the North Central Healthcare staff leadership to identify what are the strategies look like to be able to service that debt in some meaningful capacity moving forward. But I wanted to be very transparent with you today. We did just receive word from staff, and this isn't a surprise, but made very clear at a recent meeting that both in 2022, this year, and 2023, there is not the ability of North Central Healthcare from operations to service that debt. So when you see the page that I'm showing you from a previous packet, this revenue assumption line, as I said, it's living and breathing. The intergovernmental North Central Healthcare debt, the idea that North Central is going to make a payment for that debt service in 2023 is not, is very, very unlikely. I would love nothing more than to come to you next meeting and say the state of Wisconsin made some preferred provider payments to North Central for nursing home and behavioral health care that are magically going to allow that, or some federal program similar to the American Rescue Plan Act, or any of the other previous programs that have happened come about again, and that debt is able to be serviced, but that's unlikely. So what that means is, as I indicated, the the debt that is owned by Marathon County is going to have to have a strategy to service that. I'm very comfortable saying that, you know, I foresaw that. I know Chair Gibbs kind of had that feeling as well. So we've been talking about what that looks like, but just in terms of your budget assumptions, that debt service payment is going to increase, and it's going to cover the debt service that is required from North Central Healthcare, which my recollection is about $3.5 million for 2023. But in terms of overall budget assumptions, we're certainly going to modify our budget or consider how it's going to impact our budget. The information Chris just provided about healthcare, similarly with the debt service I just referenced, and then also we are getting very close to having more accurate numbers in terms of what our the true cost of that proposed salary schedule is going to be, and we'll bring that to you as well. On that front, building those projections for class compensation, I can just tell you that walking over here, I did ask one of our department heads, our health officer, how those meetings are going. She was just walking out of them. Without fail, I've heard very positive things. It's been a pleasure to work with McGrath. I think they're doing a good job. They're responsive to our requests and really our requests for additional information, as Chris kind of alluded to with health insurance. We're doing the same thing on the salary front. Hey, help us understand why you're taking this approach, why you're arriving at this number. But those projections, we'll be able to give you more definite numbers in the next, hopefully, 2 or 3 weeks. So with that, happy to take any questions, Mr. Chair.
Are there any questions? Supervisor Marsh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know that when the North Central Healthcare was being debated, there was pro forma financial statements saying we're doing this because we're going to get more increased payments from the state and it will pay for itself. I understand 2023 just coming out of the pandemic, but is there anticipation that 2024 they will be able to meet those projections?
I don't know that I can answer that. I can tell you that Kurt and I, Chair Gibbs and I both serve on the North Central Healthcare Board and the Executive Committee, and that is exactly the tact we're taking. 2023, we know that's not going to happen, but what does 2024 look like? And to build on your point about the ability to service debt, that was the analysis was the pro formas in terms of increased ability to increase charges relative to nursing home reimbursements, ability to limit diversions on the behavioral health side. Those things were integral to that. There was, however, I will say, even at that time, the idea that if North Central needs 25 years to service that debt, even though a lot of the debt is going to be borrowed on a 20-year basis, I know that point was discussed, but as it relates specifically to 2024, do I know that they're going to be able to service that debt? No, but I will tell you in all of my budget meetings this year, I am asking all of the departments to start to have a discussion about the idea of interdepartmental services. So as it relates to North Central, the same conversation. And we're going to have that discussion tomorrow at a North Central Healthcare Executive Committee meeting about the ability to provide jail meals and how, if there are opportunities for us, rather than use a vendor, an outside vendor, do it internally, because keeping those dollars within the county, we get to essentially continue to spend them, right? So we're having those conversations in every budget meeting with the intent being, how do we improve the Marathon County financial outlook? But I know North Central is doing the exact same thing with jail meals. And we're going to continue to look for those other opportunities with the intent being, how do we service that debt?
Chair Gibbs.
I just, I would expand upon a couple of things. I think that some of the challenges that NCHC is seeing, and specifically at the nursing home, is staffing. And staffing issues is not something that was foreseen when the financials and the projections were developed. The pandemic has exacerbated some of those challenges for employment, especially in the healthcare industry. And so it's not just Marathon County's nursing home that's seeing that. All nursing homes are seeing that. In fact, you're seeing quite a few closures in the private sector in the nursing home industry. And so there's lots of challenges, but I'm confident that it's going to be addressed in the best possible way. And they're continually reviewing options and opportunities to increase revenue.
Supervisor Hart.
And I just had a question on clarification. The debt service for our Central Healthcare, that's just related to operations. It's not related to the construction, correct? That they're not going to be able to service?
No, the debt service that Marathon County is responsible for is the debt service relative to the borrowing that Marathon County performed on North Central's behalf to essentially finance the construction. It is not related. Certainly, the operational impacts have impacted the ability of North Central to essentially develop the funds to service the debt, but the debt service is related to borrowing. I hope that answers your question.
So for clarification, then, while we realize that North Central can't make the payments in 2022 and 2023, we continue to carry that debt with the expectation that at some point in time, North Central will repay the county for that amount. That's correct?
That is the general intent.
So we are deferring that to a future point in time. Supervisor Baker, did you want to make a comment?
request, actually.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Robinson. I would request that as we present the budget, that we would have more detail, not just the department totals, but that we would have budget items by account number and account description. I'm not requesting that we do additional work, but I believe those are being budgeted already in our budget transfers. We have account numbers and descriptions and budget amounts, so I'm assuming that we're budgeting by that detail. I looked at 3 randomly selected counties, Brown, Eau Claire, and Washington, their budgets. Each of those provides substantially more detail than we receive. And in particular, Brown county has really provided a lot of very well organized and detailed information. So if you want to look at that as an example, but that would give me a much higher comfort level voting yes for the budget than I would be able to if I just have the summary data. Thank you.
Anything else relative to budget assumptions, questions? If not, we will continue to get updated as we hear those, but it was important that we bring that issue to you. All right, now we will go back into item 5A. A motion to go into closed session, if someone would like to make that motion, if they could read it. Chair Gibbs.
Make a motion to go into closed session pursuant to Wisconsin State Statute 19.85, Parent 1, Parent E, for the purpose of deliberating or negotiating the purchase or of public properties, the investment of public funds, or conducting other specified public business whenever competitive or bargaining reasons require a closed session, to wit, review of appraisal for and discussion of strategy regarding the potential sale of certain county properties and the potential purchase of private property adjacent to county-owned properties.
Is there a second? Any discussion on the motion? If not, the clerk will call the roll.
Robinson.
Aye.
Leahy. Gibbs.
Aye.
Marshall. Hart. Lemmer. Zhang.
That motion carries unanimously. We are in closed session, so public access will take just a minute to get down. We'll have to deal with do we have anybody on?